Thank you. And would you be in a position, Mr. Sabi, to give us a list, maybe not comprehensive, but a list of all those who've been invited to contribute to these proceedings and who may have declined to do so?
Yes, sir. On behalf of the tribunal, we have sent invitations primarily to the Embassy of the People's Republic of China in London, with reminders and many requests for their engagement with this tribunal and making a statement. No answer had been received. We have similarly sent invitations to prominent health authorities in the Republic of China, including Dr. Huang Jiefu and also the present director of the China donor system, Qatar's Dr. Heibel. None of them had answered. We have also invited the members, the past and present presidents of the Transplantation Society, and we have engaged with them. We have received correspondence from them, which would be made at the tribunal's disposal. We have also engaged with Declaration of Istanbul Custodian Group, and their responses had been sent. It will be put at the disposal of tribunal. In addition, we have communicated with Bishop Sorrento, the Chancellor of Pontifical Academy, and the Director of World Health Organization. No answers have been received.
And all these individuals or bodies are those who, from their writings or statements, might have been, all these people or bodies are those from whose writings or statements might have been able to help with comment, evidence, opinion favorable to the People's Republic of China in respect of organ harvesting practices.
Whoever had made statements to that effect and had come to our attention, we have made an invitation and asked them to contribute to the tribunal likewise, and if possible, appear in person or make a statement. But none had been received so far.
And when you say at the disposal of the tribunal, what that will mean is that all relevant correspondence will be on the website in due course.
All the correspondence had been copied and scanned, which will be provided to you with a complete index during the coming week.
And then finally, the United Kingdom's government, through at least two ministers, has expressed doubt upon the evidence of three of the witnesses who we will hear from this afternoon. They were written to requesting publication to us of any analysis that they had of the shortcomings of the evidence, and then asked to appear in person. They declined, but said they would send someone to come to today's hearing.
We have been writing to Mr. Field, who's the minister in the Foreign Commonwealth Office, and he will be sending Mr. Billington, I'm not sure he's present here, to act as observer for the FCO. Next witness is Torsten Trey.
Okay.
It starts at page. Sorry.
Marcus, we need to give him the bundle.
305.
Yes, yeah, please take a seat.
Take this. Three, 305. Yeah.
For coming to give evidence at the tribunal. And of course, I'm sure you'll be careful to tell us nothing but the truth.
I will. Thank you for having me here.
Thank you, Mr. Trey, for coming here. You're from the Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. What's your position in that organization?
I am the executive director of the NGO Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting.
If you don't mind, I'll take you directly to a question that was raised by Professor Elliott a few minutes ago from the last witness. If you go to page 21 of your report, which I think would, there is a chart here that shows in United Kingdom, we have 21 million registered donors. In United States, we have 140 million registered donors. And in China, according to their data, we have only 375,000. But the end result is that we get 5,146 out of 375,000 registered donor, deceased donors, while in United Kingdom and United States, it's 0.01%. Is that correct? It's much smaller ratio, although we have a much bigger pool. I'm asking the question, is the result in China 140 times of the United Kingdom?
To understand this, this table, we have to compare the registered organ donors and those who actually, the group out of this pool that passes away every year. And you find in the second line the number of the actual eligible organ donors. But now there's a discrepancy between those who pass away as registered organ donors and those who eventually become eligible organ donors. For example, in the UK, only 1% of the registered organ donors who pass away each year, only 1% become eventually organ donors. And we have put this number, the eligible organ donors who eventually become organ donors, into relation to the entire pool of registered organ donors. And the rate you will find in the last row. And if we compare these numbers, it is very typical that about 1% of the 0.01% of the registered organ donors become eligible organ donors. However, in China, this ratio is 140 times as large as in many other countries. So we consider this as an inconsistent ratio.
Now back to your statement, can you mention generally how you have approached this issue of the forced organ harvesting in China, and what is the basis of your conclusions?
This is a very broad question.
Yes, it is. I'm afraid.
Our conclusion is that the explanation of the organ source is cannot be, or is not, cannot be does not follow the official explanation. It is complex because before 2015, the explanation for the organ source were executed prisoners. But we found that before 2015, executed prisoners cannot explain the exponential increase of transplantations in China. After 2015, the pattern has changed because executed prisoners were not anymore were officially not called the source for the organs. After 2015, the public organ donation program was used as an explanation for the organ sources. But we found that in the organ donation program, there are also inconsistencies. So in both scenarios, before 2015 and after 2015, the explanation of the organ source is not sufficient. We postulate that there is an undisclosed organ donor pool.
I understand. You say in page 2 of your report, and rightly so, that there is no direct evidence. Those who have been organ harvested are dead and cremated, and the other authorities are keeping it secret. Can you explain why one can rely on indirect evidence, as you're suggesting here? And how come you get to these conclusions without any direct evidence of the organ donation, organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience?
It is very rare that any type of crime or murder is taking place with a camera in the room, with witnesses around. So in most of the cases, the preferred evidence, the hard evidence, the footage, the witness is not present. In this case, we are even talking about a political system that has all the ability to conceal the crime. So it is very difficult if the hard evidence is the only acceptable criteria to accept forced organ harvesting as a reality. It is very difficult. But the amount and the complexity of indirect and circumstantial evidence is tremendous, and it is sufficient to trigger international independent investigations.
If you look at page 6 of your report, which is page 310 of that book, you're showing the figures for transplant tourism. What year does these numbers refer to? So 2016?
This table is part of a publication that was published in 2016. It is a review of 86 medical papers that were published over 15 years, between 2000 and 2015, I believe. So these numbers is a summary of transplant tourism documented in peer-reviewed papers between 2000 and 2015.
So these are cumulative figures?
Yes.
It's not annual figures?
Right.
So it cannot help us with the numbers of tourists to transplant tourism to China for each year?
No. Okay. But if we would look at all the 86 medical papers that were published, then we could probably see to which years these individual publications refer to. Just this table does not provide the answer to this question.
Thank you. You referred to the expansion of the infrastructure of China's transplant industry. Can you briefly explain to the tribunal how it has increased and at what rate?
Again, this is a difficult question to answer.
If it helps, you have it at page 9 of your report.
There are individual cases where individual transplant centers were followed and the expansion in particular transplant hospitals were observed. For example, in the report, there's an example of the Beijing 309 Transplant Hospital and the Tianjin Transplant Center. But there are other transplant centers that were followed over the course of the years, and the expansion follows in different or at different times.
Yes, but the rate of increase in the infrastructure of the transplantation, the number of beds, can you give a general review? How fast it has progressed, and what is the capacity compared to other countries like United Kingdom and United States?
I cannot give an answer right now.
I'm afraid we are pressed by time, but there was a note at page 15 of your document, which is page 319, regarding that the allegations that Falun Gong practitioners are subject to forced organ harvesting was not initially put forward by Falun Gong practitioners, but by non-Falun Gong practitioners. Can you explain the background of that to the tribunal, please?
Well, in early 2006, there were reports that were published in the Epoch Times. There were journalists who originally is is Chinese but worked in Japan. He brought up the issue that forced organ harvesting takes place in Sujiatun. Then the wife of Chinese transplant surgeon with the name Annie, she came forward and stated that her husband disclosed to her that he removed corneas from 2,000 Falun Gong practitioners, and the military veteran doctor wrote letters to the Epoch Times. Then the first report from David Kilgore and David Metters were published. The EU Vice President Edward McMahon Scott visited practitioners in China and heard about the organ harvesting from a friend, and so this is the first time that this topic of forced organ harvesting was raised to the international community, and these hints were raised by non-Falun Gong practitioners. However, all of them were basically pointing out that Falun Gong practitioners are being targeted.
One more question. If you look at page 20 of your report, page 324 of our document, you point out to the massive increases in registered donors, which had been addressed by our previous witness as well. But you also say in the middle of the page that more than 60% of all newly registered organ donors were registered in only 7 days. And the 4-year program existed. Can you explain how that works?
Yes, if you look at the figure number 9, you see that the numbers after by the end of 2016 were around 200,000. Yet in December 31st, 2015, 25,000 of those numbers were added, and in December 3rd, or in the last week of December 2016, 88,000 donors were added. So if you take these numbers from the last week of December 2016 and December 31st, 2015, you get a number that is higher than 150,000 donors, and that is more than 50% that were accumulated until 2016. If you take the beginning from 2013 to 2016 as a time frame, you get to this statement.
And consequently, you believe these figures are false?
if you take the number of December 31st, 2015, within one day, 25,000 donors were added. For once, it is unusual that this high number is added within one day. But what is even more concerning is that the number ending on 3 zeros, exactly 25,000. So we are talking not about a statistic where you can round up or down. If you talk about an organ donor system, then you have actual donors, real names, real individuals, and it is it is incomprehensible to have exactly 25,000 individuals by name, with a real identity being added on one day.
Thank you. The tribunal has a question.
Okay, Doctor, I was wondering if you could, on page 30, you have a chart in your report, and it's for the tribunal, it's page 334. And in this, you have a chart here that has the Falun Gong, Christians, Uyghurs, and the Tibetans. And I want to focus on the last three groups. So this data looks like some of these numbers are from 2010, and then you also cite the Novak report from 2006, the UN report. But specifically for the Christians, what is this? It says negative, I don't even know how to read this number, 2%, less than 2%. Do you know if there are Christians that are targeted for their organs, or if there are, or is organ harvesting of Christians going on?
We have too little data to come to a conclusion on this.
Now, why is that? What is it? Because you have access to more people in the Falun Gong who are reporting it out, or what's the reason for that?
We rely on data that is reported to us, and we get almost no reports on Christians being targeted on organ harvesting. So at this point, it is too vague to come to a conclusion. But we see a high risk within this group.
Okay, where does your data come from that you're relying on?
It is based on medical papers sometimes, and sometimes newspapers, media.
Okay, now is that the same analysis for the Uyghurs and the Tibetans, or is it different?
They are similar, but there are a little bit more. There's more information.
Okay.
However, to provide this information, it requires kind of a network which allows to convey the information. And there's just less information available or being reported, being publicized.
Okay, on the Uyghurs and the Tibetans as well?
More than about the Christians.
Christians, okay.
But still not enough.
Okay, so do you think that the numbers that you've reported in here have changed now in 2019? Between all four groups, or do you think there's one group that's probably more now?
Well, within these three groups, I believe that the risk for the Uyghurs is increasing.
Okay.
Because of the more systematic categorization. You probably heard about the mass DNA database that allows the screening. Mm-hmm. And there are signs, for example, in airports, you probably heard about this, that which allow for a fast track transport for organ transplantations, which are indicators that there's more activity.
Okay, that's good.
Thank you. I understand that Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting is an advocacy association. I was wondering if you have carried out any international advocacy in order to achieve an international independent investigation, and if the answer is yes, what have you achieved so far? to reach that end.
So can you repeat the first part of the question?
Have you ever conducted an international advocacy aiming to establish an international investigation on forced organ harvesting in China? Because you talked about, you mentioned that the evidence are sufficient enough to trigger an international independent investigation.
Well, from between 2012 and 2018, we have organized a global petition to the United Nations, where we highlighted this issue and basically asked for international investigations. So far, we have not seen action on this. We have spoken at different forums in medical associations and parliamentarian hearings. We had publications where we asked for investigations. The resonance to look into forced organ harvesting that is focused on China is extremely difficult. There seems to be like a layer that just doesn't want to look into this topic. I believe if it happened in a different country, action would have been taken much earlier.
I want to finish. I'm sorry. We may have until 2:15, but it'd be good to finish if we can by just after 2.
So could I just ask you, Dr. Trey, if what you think as a representative of Doctors Against Forced Organ Extraction, what should the world medical community do in relation to clearly a significant number of doctors in China who appear to be engaged in an activity which in the rest of the world would not be judged ethical? How should the wider medical community behave?
The medical profession is known for its medical oath to not do harm. If every medical doctor would just remember this, I believe there would be the drive to find out what is happening. A gold standard, I believe, for transplant medicine is transparency. For example, in the United States, every hospital reports its transplant numbers. You don't find this information in China. In China, you get a national transplant number, but you cannot find out which hospital contributed to how many transplants. If the medical community, for example, would make it a standard that each country has to report transplant numbers by individual transplant hospitals, then it would create transparency and it would allow scrutiny. So that would be a step that would be very necessary from the medical community, because transparency doesn't do any harm. It only helps to reveal where harm is being done. Another approach would be something that has been missed for a long time, and that is early on we talked about hard evidence. There is hard evidence. There's hard evidence in the transplant patients, transplantors who travel to China. When they leave the country, they have the hard evidence in their bodies, which are the organs. So there is a way that if globally all transplantors who went to China would agree to a biopsy, and you would build up a DNA database of these organs, and then would collect DNA from persecuted prisoners of conscience in China, for example, Falun Gong practitioners, where you collect the DNA of those Falun Gong practitioners, then in such database, you could compare the DNA from the organs, transplanted organs, and those who went missing, who were tortured to death, etc. Then you could medically establish that organs were taken from Falun Gong practitioners. It is basically, well, it is because of the cover-up in China, it is very difficult to get this information. But by using this medical method, you could actually prove it outside China. So these are the steps that the medical community could do.
Until the science makes that possible, matching the data sets makes that possible, what should, for example, international transplant scientific meetings, the Transplant Society, do about the doctors practicing in China in transplantation if we can't rely on the data, as you suggest, that they're presenting?
Well, in the before 2000, the transplant medicine in China was not that well established. And since 2000, not only the numbers increased, the transplant hospitals increased, but the knowledge about transplantation has increased. And I believe that this advantage in transplant medicine is being built on the blood and the bodies of prisoners of conscience, mainly Falun Gong practitioners. If you look at this picture, then inviting transplant surgeons for medical training to the West is equal to educating them how they can commit their crimes against humanity even better. So I believe that until it is 100% guaranteed that no forced organ harvesting takes place in China, any cooperation in the transplant medical field is unethical in terms of training or helping transplant surgeons from China.
No, sorry.
Do you all investigate any other country besides China?
The mission of our association is forced organ harvesting, which we define as taking organs without consent and with where the organ donor is being killed. This is a niche topic. This is different from commercial organ trafficking. So when we look at this, we don't find this in other countries. What we have seen is that in 2016, I believe, it was reported that ISIS was meeting this criteria, but otherwise we don't find this because it is including the killing of the organ source, and that is not seen in other countries.
Just very briefly, there have been a number of international doctors' organizations, including the Transplantation Society, who have rebutted this allegation. In your view, is that genuine ignorance or is it willful ignorance?
That is a difficult question because you asked me about the intent. But if you ask me about my opinion, then I would say it is willful. For example, when we provide data, information for years, reports, then what I see in communication with representatives from the TDS, I often hear that they have not even read the reports. And when there are visits to hospital, inspection tours to hospitals. It is only to pre-selected hospitals, which is meaningless. And if we ask them to look into detention camps, then they say we are not in the position to investigate. We are a professional organization. We don't have the means to investigate in detention camps. My problem here is that I understand that they might not be in the position to conduct investigations in detention camps. However, at the same time, there's also the expertise that China, the expertise that China has developed and is now follows ethical standards in transplant medicine. And I find this is a discrepancy to, on one side, establish that they follow ethical rules, on the other side, then decline to conduct investigations in detention camps or to look into hospitals that were not pre-selected. So there's a bias, and that's why I think it's willful.
Does your organization, or indeed do you have any particular closeness to Falun Gong by membership or anything like that?
Our members are from all walks of life, from all countries, and they have all different kinds of belief systems, if you ask this question. There are also members who practice Falun Gong, but usually this is a question, the belief system is a question that is not raised to members, because
that's fine, but you understand that we have to consider this matter because of attacks that may or may not be made on these hearings. Your answer is sufficient unless you want to go further. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming to the tribunal to give your evidence, which is now concluded. And of course, you're welcome to stay and sit at the back or wherever, if there's a seat. And our next witness, Ms. Nice or Mr. Sabi?
David Mathis is joining us online.
He's joining us online with vision or not? I understand he might possibly be traveling. Oh.
He's going to call in at the moment, so he's going to call the line and then
so we'll just have to wait for a few minutes, a couple of minutes. Thank you. We're waiting for the connection with Mr. Matas. The particular topic that Mr. Matas, David Matas, and two others will be dealing with is in part to do with things that the British government has said, isn't it? So can we just check, is there anybody, as was promised by their Foreign Office, anybody here from the Foreign and Commonwealth Office? If so, we can make available to that person the statement that's being prepared. Anybody here? No? Well, I think Mr. Sabi, unless they arrive between now and the end of the day, it would be appropriate to ensure that this statement is sent to them by email marked urgent. Will it be just audio or audio and visual? Right. Fine. Are you able to hear him at the moment?
It's just calling back. When you first called, the system didn't link you through the PA, so now it's ringing back to that.
Right.
Yeah, can you hear us, sir? Okay.
Mr. Matters, can you hear me? Jeffrey Nice here.
Yes, I can hear you.
Thank,
But I can hear you.
thank you very much for making yourself available again. Of course, you'll be telling us the truth. I'm sure, I hope you will. We know that you're at an airport and have adjusted things so that you can be available to us. The summary is that a joint statement has been prepared by you, Mr. Gutman, and Mr. Kilgour, and we're going to ask, or rather, Council will be asking you a few questions about that. I hope you'll excuse us if we take liberties by, or if Council takes liberties by leading, summarizing, and reading material as quickly as possible to get through to your answers. Thank you.
Yes, that's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Matters. And to further to what the chairman has explained, Ethan Gutman will be speaking after you, and he is in the room. So if time does not allow to finish, he can pick up from where you left off on your statement. Your statement has provided a quotation from the debate that took place in the House of Parliament in London on the 26th of March, in which Mark Field, who's the Minister of State for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, spoke about your work and your 2016 update. I'm going to refer to a few of the comments in that quote and then ask you to respond. He said at the outset that his officials have studied the latest report carefully. Can you just clarify for our benefit whether or not they approached you before or after to identify what the nature of that study was?
No, I've not been approached.
Thank you. He spoke about your report in some of the following terms. He said that as authors, you acknowledge that there is a lack of incontrovertible evidence of wrongdoing. He said that the authors made clear that they have no smoking gun and that there is a less than rigorous research technique applied. He said that you still make some assumptions and that you are having to infer the scale of organ transplant system from hospitals' promotional material. Taking those in turn, can you respond to the suggestion that you acknowledge a lack of incontrovertible evidence of wrongdoing?
There's no such acknowledgement. I've word searched the report. There's nothing similar to that. In fact, we have 2,400 footnotes, 2,200 of them come from official Chinese sources. I would say the reverse, that our evidence is incontrovertible and certainly has not been controverted.
Thank you. Reference to there being no smoking gun was also made. Can you respond to that?
The point we were making there, we do use the phrase smoking gun or smoking tobacco, but the point we were making is that we drew conclusions from a number of different pieces of evidence rather than from one piece of evidence. We didn't mean to say, and we certainly didn't say, that there's nothing to prove what happened conclusively, but rather that what is proving what we conclude is an accumulation of different pieces of evidence rather than one single conclusion. So it is a distortion of what we said to isolate that comment about no smoking gun when we're saying it comes from not one but all, to extract the phrase but all and say it doesn't.
Thank you. Sorry, thank you. And the reference to less than rigorous research techniques.
Well, he doesn't really specify what he means by that. He may mean
I'm sorry to interrupt, but we lost from when I stopped asking my last question. Could I ask you to repeat that? So the response to the less rigorous research techniques.
Yes, well, what I was saying was that Human Rights Watch did a similar sort of report looking at the sourcing many years before us about the sourcing organs in China from death penalty prisoners, including that they were being sourced from death penalty prisoners at the time when China denied that was happening. And they were prepared to rely on secondary evidence, which we did not. So I would say that we had a more rigorous research protocol than Human Rights Watch did. And of course, what Human Rights Watch concluded turned out to be true, and China acknowledged that they were sourcing organs for prisoners sentenced to death.
And the reference made to assumptions, you've given a longer explanation in your response. Is there anything else you'd like to add or an explanation of that you'd like to give?
Well, maybe I appreciate it's a long statement and response. Maybe I can shorten it a bit by saying that we did, in trying to figure out volumes, look at all data streams. And one of the data streams we looked at was minimum bed requirement. And we had a very low utilization rate of one operation per day for operating them. So what we did is looked at the number, we made an assumption that people were meeting minimum requirements, because if they didn't meet them, they would either not get registered or be deregistered. But that sort of assumption doesn't mean our whole report was based on assumption. But one of the data streams we looked at was an underestimate based on an assumption of minimum use. So again, it's a gross distortion to suggest our report was based on assumption.
Thank you. The reference to relying on hospital data, you've explained that you don't rely on that alone. Can you expand on that explanation?
Well, again, this is kind of selective. Picking out one thing up out of context, sure, we looked at hospital data is one of the data streams, but because we were cross-checking every which way we could, bed count, staff count, the research reports, the newsletters, week reports. So what it does is pick up one or two of those data streams and says, on their own, they're unreliable. Well, the question is not whether one piece of evidence justifies the conclusion, but whether all of the evidence justifies the conclusion. So it's misrepresenting what we're doing.
Thank you. That takes us to about halfway through your response. Strictly speaking, we're quite close to the end of the time that was allocated to you. Ethan Gutmann is here as well to respond to the second half of that report, but I would ask if the panel have any other questions on the content so far, that they can put those to you now.
Yes, Jeffrey Nice here, because you can't see us. I think, Mr. Mattis, you will appreciate that tribunal judges are unlikely to feel able to act on conclusions on the central issues facing a tribunal. It's a matter of some legal practice of long standing. But nevertheless, can you tell us, please, with what degree of, with what strength you hold the views you have expressed in your first report and in the update?
Well, I haven't seen anything to refute any of it. I have tried to think of possible refutations, but they just disintegrate on further analysis. I mean, I think that what Mr. Field has done is a good example of, this is not a realistic position he's taking. It's not a plausible position. I just don't see any creditable challenge to the conclusions we reach.
So the strength of your opinion is what? You still there? I think he's gone. I hope it wasn't what I said. Come back. Are you there, Mr. Mattis?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh, right. Did you hear my last question? I said, so the strength of your conclusion is what? How strong is it?
How strong? Well, I would say it's as strong as I simply do not have any reservations. I have no qualifications. I have no hesitation. In a legal context, I have no doubt. I don't see any reason to question that conclusion. There's just been nothing substantive to contradict the conclusion.
Thank you. I think two other questions so that I can pass questioning to my colleagues if there's time. As we all know, you and Ethan Goodman and Mr. Kilgour feature prominently in the consideration of other authoritative bodies looking at this issue. And there's always a problem with what I think is sometimes called false collateral. So I want you to tell us what was the first trigger for your being interested in this issue? And if you can, give a very swift summary of the sequential development of your work and research.
Well, the first trigger was a simple request to investigate this. And I was asked to do it not on the basis of finding a conclusion I did, but just to determine whether it was true or not. Because this woman with the pseudonym Annie in Washington, D.C. had said this was happening. Chinese government denied it, and I had been involved doing a lot of human rights work, and I knew it was the sort of thing that the NGOs would have difficulty doing because it involved a lot of evidentiary work, that a lot of research, and so anyhow, I agreed to do it basically to determine whether this was true or not. That was the trigger.
And how soon did you become involved with either Mr. Kilgour or Mr. Goodman, working together with them?
Well, the sequence was that there was an NGO in Washington, which Coalition to Investigate Persecution Against Hong Kong, that went to the Executive Commission, Congressional Investigation on China, and asked them to do something about what Randy had said, and they had said that the coalition needed an NGO or research to look into what Randy said. So then the coalition started looking around and approached David Kilgour with a list of 20 names of people who do the research. And I've known David Kilgour ever since university. So he said he could do the research with me, and so they came to me. That was the sequence of events.
Thank you. And finally, from me, do you personally have any particular proximity to Falun Gong as a belief system?
No, I'm not a practitioner. I never have been. I don't have any associations with China other than professional. I don't have any Chinese relatives. For me, this is strictly a professional.
Thank you. There may be other questions.
Mr. Matt,
Yes.
I'll go very slowly. Mr. Mattis, in your, my name is Nicholas Vetch, I'm one of the tribunalists. In your statement released to us this morning, you talk about the UK government, by way of example, putting up a smoke screen, and you also cite similar actions from the Australian government and to a slightly lesser extent, the US government. Could you let us know what the motive for, I suppose I might call it this obstruction, might be?
Well, fundamentally awkward for governments who want
Mr. Mattis, I think that's everything from the tribunal. Thank you again for coming or being available a second time to the tribunal. And that's the end of your evidence, and safe travels.
Well, thank you very much, and good luck with your work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ethan Gutman is our next witness in person, who I assume has a copy of his report with him. Do you need it? No, he doesn't.
And Mr. Gutman, thank you for coming again to the tribunal. Please be sure to tell us nothing but the truth. Did you hear that, Mr. Gutman?
I'm sorry?
Thank you for coming the second time to the tribunal. Please be sure to give us nothing but the truth.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. To repeat what we spoke about very briefly with Mr. Mattis just now, you attended the parliamentary debate on the 26th of March this year.
Yes, I did.
And the reference that was made during that talk to your work and the fact that the officials of the minister who was speaking have studied your latest report carefully, had they contacted you before or after to confirm what the nature of their studies were or provide you with any analysis they'd done?
No. However, I should add that I did speak to, I can't remember his name, but the main fellow with the Foreign Office who would be responsible for looking at that report.
Mark Field, the MP? Or?
No, it's another fellow, I'm sorry, but he's a staffer, but staffers usually are the ones who actually do the grunt work on this. And we had sort of somewhat heated words because I had brought up the idea. I asked him, this was publicly in a meeting, if how good his Chinese was. You see, there are 2,400 footnotes, endnotes in the update. And the fact is, unless you have very, very good Chinese ability, it's awfully difficult to go through those. And so I mentioned that there were 3 mainland Chinese who work at the Congressional Executive Commission on China who spent 5 weeks going through our endnotes. And there's a friendly relationship with the United States and the UK. There's nothing preventing him from picking up the phone and talking to them about their assessment.
So that was a conversation you had with him on the 26th?
No, this was previously. This is,
Okay.
I'm saying this is the only contact I've
Right,
had
yeah.
on this. What he's extrapolating from what he said, it seems that I don't think he was even really claiming that he'd gone through the endnotes.
Thank you. The references to lack of incontrovertible evidence, no smoking gun, less than rigorous research techniques, assumptions, and inferring the scale of the organ transplant system from promotional material. Have you heard, for the sake of argument, allegations about your work in those terms before?
Not the promotional material. That's new.
But the others you have heard before?
I think so. Look, the smoking gun thing is obviously taken as very out of context. If you actually read what we said in the report, we threw in that phrase. It seemed to me, maybe I'm mistaken here, but it seems to me he's actually quoting from a movie called Hard to Believe, where the narrator says, they didn't find a smoking gun or a smoking scalpel. Now, I had nothing to do, I may be in that movie a lot, but I had nothing to do with that narration. It was really done by a former PBS producer. I had no control over it, and I wouldn't have had wanted control over it. But it seems to me that's what he's actually quoting from, not from our report, because why would you quote? I mean, it's quite clear in here that we're saying we have a series of smoking guns and so forth, and there's so many points of evidence, and put together, that's what creates the sort of a killing zone of evidence. So I think that was a little surprising that somebody would mention it quite that way. What was the other?
Well, there's a lack of incontrovertible evidence, the smoking gun, the less than rigorous research techniques, and the assumptions.
Yeah, I think the assumptions is I would say of all the points, that's the fairest one, because one does have to make assumptions. We're not in a war with China. We're not overrunning their positions. We can't examine the hospitals on the ground. What we can do is look at, as I've always said, that we can look at what the Ministry of Health puts out as the minimum requirements for every hospital which is permitted to do transplants. And those minimum requirements, are 40 beds and several transplant teams, dedicated transplant teams, with 40 dedicated transplant beds, and among other things. And now, if you put that together, well, look, we're not there with a clipboard. We're not walking around making sure that's, people cut corners in China. I'm well aware of that. And so I think you have to make some, in that sense, you have to make some assumptions, but they're reasonable assumptions based on actual data.
And one of the points you made in your response of today's date is that some of the assumptions of the minimum use of facilities, which in a sense is going to be an underestimate.
Oh, it's definitely an underestimate.
So assumptions aren't.
Well, there's two ways it's an underestimate. I think it's important to identify. Mm-hmm. One is that actually, if we actually ran the numbers, and although I did this in conjunction with Kilgore and Matus, I'm the main one responsible for the numbers in that report. I actually lowered them significantly from what I was coming up with, which was about 125,000. That's the highest range. And there was no good way to do this. I had to simply go on the fact that I've lived in China, and my experience is that people in factories exaggerate their output by about 20%, always. Resumes exaggerate the time they spent at a company by about 20%. I mean, it's a rough figure, but the truth is the number was actually significantly higher. So that's true. These are indeed estimates. I wouldn't argue with that at all. And we did have to lower them significantly because there is that tendency to sort of claim overproduction on a local level and on a national level as well sometimes. In the case of the national level, we know they're trying to keep the numbers down. And in the case of the local level, they're pushing their output up.
Thank you. In your response, you talk about, or there was reference to the sort of the infrastructure of government responses to your work, and you make some comparisons. Do you want to expand on that at all, or would you prefer to leave it in the context?
I don't need to expand on, I think, what's said in the statement. I think Matus is just, he wrote a lot of that, and I think it's very accurate.
And so on reflection, you consider it was a complete misrepresentation?
I think it's fine. It's perfectly fine to critique report. I think we should welcome that. The problem, again, is, for example, with the Congressional Executive Commission on China, after going through all the footnotes, they came back and asked me some questions about the report. And specifically, they went in through some numbers with me. And I had no problem with that at all. That's perfectly legitimate. All they wanted was transparency from us on methodology. And I think that's just, as for example, what you're doing today with the Jacob Levine, Matthew Robinson, and the other fellows, statistics. I think it's perfectly legitimate. The problem here is that it's being used as a recipe for inaction. I mean, this is just This is a simple attempt to push the problem aside. I understand that this is a country, I live here in London, and I have for 12 years. I understand that Brexit's a big concern and there's many economic uncertainties and that people don't want to add to that at this particular point. But it is also true that this has been going on for 12 years or more, actually, significantly more. And so I would have thought that saying, well, transplant volumes is a real problem in China, something along that line would have been a more legitimate response. Because I think that's unavoidable, really, if you look at the report, because there are so many evidence trails leading into that same conclusion. In fact, we don't find any one piece of evidence that stands against this except the official numbers that China came out with. And now those are extremely flexible. Now they're saying they're going to be at 40,000 transplants per year by next year.
Thank you. I have one more question, and then I'll pass over to the panel. In that debate, there was also a reference by the minister to his belief that relatively few people from the UK travel to China for transplants. Do you have any data that identifies numbers? Or would you know where he got that from?
I think that is all we know. All we can say is that we did FOIA requests. I didn't do them, but a fellow I know did them, and he did them very carefully, to, I believe, about over 50 hospitals in this country, asking if they had transplant patients who'd gone to China. All of them, every single one, came back saying, medical confidentiality, we can't talk about it. Now, 5 of them said the equivalent of, well, medical confidentiality, but we tried to tell them not to go. Okay. How many of the others didn't put that statement or a similar statement in? I don't know. I do know that I did talk to a man, I interviewed him over dinner in Birmingham, who received a kidney in Xi'an Military Hospital.
Thank you. Those are all my questions.
Same questions, Mr. Gutman, as for the previous witness. You may feel free to answer them by single-word answers if you can. With what strength do you hold your opinions?
I'm going to avoid a single-word answer because on that one, because I would say
give us your answer then, please.
They have grown stronger and stronger because of the Uyghur situation. It is as if we are seeing a speeded up version of the Falun Gong persecution. It's just happening at a sort of 5 times the speed.
Do you have any doubts about your conclusions?
No.
First trigger for you to investigate these matters?
I was in China when the Falun Gong persecution took place. I remember the day quite vividly and clearly because sound trucks appeared on the street and because I was working at Beijing TV and several people started weeping. It was like watching a big family fight erupt at a dinner table. I mean,
but the first trigger into investigating organ harvesting.
That was really kind of an accident. I was interviewing a witness, an older lady, she's about my age, who actually had received, she mentioned along the way that she'd received an exam, and that exam included clearly a cornea exam, but didn't include any corresponding tests of her eyesight. And, you know, of course I knew about the organ harvesting issue, but she clearly didn't. And that was sort of ideal because I had the feeling there's no way she could be spinning me here. In fact, she didn't even want to talk about it.
So again, just to take it quickly, you started an investigation which led to a book called The Slaughter.
Yeah.
When were you first working together with, in any sense, Mattis and Kilgour, with whom you've written something called The Update, and now the 3 of you have written this statement?
In 2006, I met David Kilgour in New York City. And we had a long conversation, but a few years later, they said, would you like to co-write Bloody Harvest, the publication of the book, with us? And I said, no. I said, I want to do my own study, but thank you. And after my own book came out, then we began to work together much more closely.
Thank you very much. Are you in any way particularly closely associated with or practitioner of Falun Gong?
No, I am an agnostic, and my wife is a militant atheist.
Finally, on page 14 of the update, there is one reference to smoking gun, which I will read out to you and ask you if this reflects your opinion. One reason that the abuse has not received the global attention it deserves is the sheer volume of evidence that needs to be marshaled to show that the abuse exists. If we had one smoking gun, or as David Kilgour has put it, one smoking scalpel, which we could brandish to show that the abuse exists, our efforts to combat the abuse would be comparatively easy. When we have volumes of evidence that have to be considered as a whole to conclude that the abuse exists, then our audience for the abuse is regrettably, but also necessarily, diminished. Is that your view?
That is my view, with one, I just make one addition to that. In my book, I do mention the smoking gun in the slaughter, so not in the 2016 report, but, and that is specifically the interview that I did with Dr. Ke Wen-je of Taiwan, who is now the mayor of Taipei. And he gave a very explicit interview because he was looking into prices of organs for his clinic in the mainland, and he went to a hospital. I don't
want to cut you too short,
yeah.
but I just want to know, is what I've read out to you your opinion?
Yes, it is.
Thank you very much. Other questions, please, from the Tribunal. Yes.
You heard Dr. Trey testify earlier about the Uyghurs, Tibetans, and the Christians, and I wanted to know, in your book, The Slaughter, you actually do refer to these groups as well. Since that time and up till now, would you say that there's any difference, increase, or decrease as to their targeting of groups for harvesting?
Yeah, I wouldn't completely agree with the statement that there's not enough evidence to establish that House Christians have been targeted, certainly, for this, because in my book it's quite explicit that Eastern Lightning was targeted, but that was quite some time ago, and according to Christian Solidarity Worldwide, they're not getting a lot of reports of this. Bob Fu tells me a slightly different story. In terms of the Tibetans, unfortunately, the community there is not very cooperative, in part because I believe the Dalai Lama's feeling that it will lead to an end to negotiations with the Chinese, with Beijing. So it's hard for us to gather information. They've been very resistant about asking debriefing questions of refugees coming out of Tibet. But we do know that the hospital facilities are far greater than they were when we originally looked at that back in 2010 or in 2012. In terms of the Uyghurs, well, there's your curve. Okay, there's your, I mean, you have maybe 1.5 million people who've all been blood tested, and they're in detention, and their families have lost sight of them. We know that and we also know that we have a bunch of different points of evidence that suggest that something is going on. The building of crematoriums and the dedicated transplant lane, as well as some of the witnesses we've heard here in the tribunal just as recently as yesterday. So I would say that it's, again, impossible. Look, it's very difficult. You can make estimates of these things maybe a couple of years after they've happened. It's like looking at a star. And it's very difficult to do it in real time. But with the Uyghur situation, this is the catastrophe. This is the thing that I'd like to see governments act upon. And that's why this business from minister has been so disappointing.
Just one follow-up. So the Uyghur situation, you also, I believe you referred to in your book, and we've heard someone testify as well, that they are tested at home. So do you think that that's indicative of organ harvesting, or that's just a general process of detention?
Look, it's interesting. One of the things that the minister did say was he said this is one of the MPs asked him a question, brought up all the points I just mentioned about the Uyghurs, the detention, the fact that they've been blood tested, the building of crematoriums and dedicated transplant land, and said, if that's not evidence, what is? And he said, well, it's not, we don't have evidence of that being state sponsored. It is impossible to test approximately 15 million people, every man, woman, and child who's Uyghur, without doing Han Chinese at the same time. This is unbelievable without it being state sponsored. That's not a private initiative. That's not some sort of scam. You can't do it. And it was done in record time. This wasn't a slow process, it was quick. Now, it was done in malls. It was done in shopping malls and all kinds of public spaces. It was also done at home. That was something that was tried out first with Falun Gong about 3 years before. And it was done on select Falun Gong practitioners who had been in detention, but were no longer in detention. So there is a precedent for it. And they were doing DNA cheek swabs at the same time, just like the Uyghurs. Right. So, is that, okay.
Thank you very much,
Thank
Mr. Goodman. Thank you for coming again. Mr. Savvy, I think you'd like to take the next witness rather than after the break now, is that right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, there is a small window available to this witness, and he may not be available, so
we'll break a little later than that.
our next week's witness is Mr. Shapiro,
Page
351. Mr. Shapiro is from University of Alberta. Yes, Mr. Chairman, he's online.
Good afternoon, Mr. Shapiro.
Good afternoon, Mr. Jeffrey and colleagues.
Thank you very much for making yourself available to the tribunal today. Please be careful to tell us the truth in all matters. You'll now be asking questions.
Thank you. Mr. Shapiro, you're the director of the clinical islet transplant program at the University of Alberta. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I'm the director of the clinical islet cell transplant program here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. I'm also professor of surgery, medicine and surgical oncology here at the university, and I hold a Canada research chair in transplantation surgery and regenerative medicine here.
Can you relate to the tribunal the experience you had in 2017 in conjunction with Zhejiang University Fourth Affiliated Hospital?
Yes, so in 2017, our then dean and our chairman of surgery had set up a collaboration with the Fourth Affiliated Hospital at Zhejiang to engage in teaching across the board in surgery and in psychiatry and other areas of medicine, really to allow that Chinese New University to capitalize on the expertise that we have at this university for teaching. And as part of that, somewhere along the way, some discussions occurred without my involvement at all, with the Fourth University being interested in learning and potentially setting up an islet cell transplant program. By way of background for this committee, as I would think you probably don't know much about islet cell transplantation, it was an experimental procedure that we were largely responsible for developing and called the Edmonton Protocol, where we take patients with type 1 diabetes and inject cells into the liver through a simple procedure that doesn't require surgery. And I published that paper in the New England Journal of Medicine in the year 2000. Before that time, there'd been very little success with islet cell transplantation in treating people with diabetes who would normally require multiple injections of insulin per day and monitoring of blood sugar. But after the Edmonton protocol, all of our first 7 patients were able to discontinue the need for insulin injections, and the cells would produce insulin in exactly the amount that the body would require. These cells are derived from organ donors, the same organ donors that provide hearts, lungs, livers, kidneys for transplantation. And in Canada, we were receiving pancreas organs from across the country from ethical consent from the standard Canadian process. And if a pancreas could not be used for whole pancreas transplantation, it would be moved to my laboratory, where we would isolate the cells from the pancreas that make insulin, and those cells would be separated in a process that takes around 6 to 8 hours. It requires a team of 5 to 6 people and considerable expertise to do that. And then we infuse those purified cells up into the liver, and then the patients need anti-rejection drugs in order to maintain their transplant. And now, 18, 19 years later, we've done around 600 of these procedures, and we're the leading center worldwide in terms of activity. So in 2017, there was some interest to set up an islet cell transplant program at this new university. As I mentioned, I was not involved. And then there was an invitation sent to me to go to visit Zhejiang University, I think in around November 2017. I can't be sure of the exact date. I couldn't go. I'm a busy liver transplant and hepatobiliary surgeon here, and I didn't want to take the time off to go there at that time. And colleagues of mine went, not on my behalf, but were also invited. So Dr. Ray Rajot, who's since retired from the university and accompanied the chairman of surgery and others. And during that visit, they discussed the design and implementation of an islet cell transplant laboratory, and discussed the possibility that they might come to Edmonton for training. And only after that visit did I hear about what had gone on. And the next thing I knew, I was invited to a meeting in the Dean's office, where the president of the 4th Affiliated Hospital attended with a delegation of around 10 to 12 of his colleagues. So that was Dr. Professor Chen. So I was invited to that meeting, a very friendly meeting, very, very nice people, very enthusiastic about what we'd achieved with the islet cell transplant Edmonton protocol. And I enjoyed the discussion with them and didn't really commit to anything, but there was a memorandum of understanding that was supposed to be written between the University of Alberta and the 4th Affiliated Hospital. And I didn't sign that, and I was reviewing the documents for that, and across my email appeared some details about forced organ harvest, and I didn't know much about that. I mean, I've seen the Falun Gong demonstrations that occur weekly outside of our farmers market downtown, but other than that, really, I hadn't been very aware of that issue, and then so that caught my eye, and I contacted the organizer of that, and I said, well, what's the evidence that this is still going on in China? And she sent me the papers from the retracted papers from the liver transplant journals from 2017, an editorial by Professor Wendy Rogers, the piece that was written about this in The Guardian, and a piece that was written in the British Medical Journal. I read these. I realized that this Zhejiang University was linked to this area where there'd been retraction of these papers, and for me that was a red flag. And so I sent those 4 documents to the dean and to the chairman of surgery. And I said, I have concerns about this based on what I have just learned, and I don't feel that I can be involved in any way, nor my program, with cooperation with this particular university until we can be absolutely sure that there is no possibility of any unethical practice with forced organ harvest. So that led to some further discussions in the university, and then they really came back to me and said, well, maybe would there be any way that you could find to work with this university? And I said, well, I would need to know with absolute certainty that there was no line that was being crossed in terms of unethical organ harvest, and how could I be sure of that? So I contacted Professor Frank Delmonico from the Transplantation Society, who I knew well from my work in liver transplantation surgery, and I'd lectured at Harvard previously, so I knew him, and I talked to him about this, and the answers that I got back were really not to my satisfaction. The bottom line of it all was that there was no way that I would be able to police the organ harvesting details in any way that would allow me to know with absolute certainty that there was no line being crossed and no unethical organ harvest. So I said, no, I cannot work with this university until that occurs. And I tried to see if we could set up through the, there was the pontifical, with the Vatican, the links there to see if we could have some third party that could act as an intermediary, again to police it for me, and I didn't feel that would be adequate. There was no real clear answers for me, and so I have never cooperated with this university in terms of training for islet cell transplantation, and I won't do so, and my team won't do so until we can be certain there is no possibility of unethical harvesting of organs.
Thank you, Dr. Shapiro. Do you recall what was exactly the date or approximately the date you spoke to Francis Delmonico?
I'd have to dig that up, but I've got emails back and forth from him. It would have been in, well, if the process began in 2017, it would have been probably within the 6 months following that, so into early 2018, I suppose. And then I also saw the paper that was released in preliminary form from Matthew Robertson and Jacob Levy, showing where the data essentially had been, to my eye, had been massaged in terms of the numbers of organ donors following mathematical curves and formulae. And I felt that again, there was sufficient concern in my mind that this was a real and ongoing activity that I could not ethically collaborate with.
Thank you. There will be some questions from the tribunal.
No, good afternoon. I'm very interested to find out whether, in common with many universities worldwide, your own university is under commercial pressure to take Chinese students or to engage with the Chinese medical community more widely.
So I can't comment on that directly because I don't have direct knowledge of that. I can tell you that our Faculty of Medicine is short of money. That I'm sure that one component of their desire to collaborate with the Chinese is financial, but I don't know that for sure. But I think it's exceedingly likely based on our position. I think some of it is altruistic on the university's behalf, from my chairman of surgery and from the dean's office, but there's clearly some financial component, and there would have been some financial further financial benefit, I presume, coming to the university if we'd agreed to train this team in islet cell transplantation.
You've, as it were, stood on the moral high ground over this issue yourself. What do you think the wider medical community engaged in transplantation of any kind should do in response to these events as you perceive them in China, or we've heard evidence about them? For example, how should international scientific meetings respond to abstracts submitted from teams in China?
Well, first and foremost, at least in Western society, my concern is around the free will and altruistic activity of organ donation. And I think if any of our leading centers, any center in the Western world, is seen to collaborate with centers where forced organ harvesting is going on, I think from the general public's perspective, it would really jeopardize the ability to continue to derive altruistic organ donation, and we rely heavily on that. And even with that, today, a relationship for altruistic donation is is tenuous. We have many patients that die on our waiting list waiting for transplant, and we desperately need more organs to go around. That's why I do a fair number of living donor liver transplants in Edmonton. But I think if we cross that line, and if others cross that line, it will jeopardize our relationship with the general public. So that I think is number one for me. And then in terms of science, I think where there is unethical practice, that science should not be presented in the public domain. That's my own personal feeling. And I know over previous years that there have been retractions of papers. I've been to scientific meetings where there have been retraction of papers from China, where it's believed that there is an unethical practice. And I think that should continue to occur until we can be certain that their practice is aligned with the rest of the world.
Thank you.
Shamir, are you a member of the Transplantation Society?
Yes, I am. Yeah, I am.
We have asked them on several occasions to comment on the allegation, and suffice it to say they've been less than helpful and even reticent. Is there, in your view, any particular reason why they should be so?
No, I can't answer that. I'm not in the higher echelons of the Transplantation Society. However, I must say I was very surprised by the response I got back from Frank Delmonico and from others that I knew or had been affiliated within the Transplantation Society. They seemed to reassure me that there'd been a seismic shift in the practice in China, and they were relying heavily upon assurances that I really couldn't see data for, and I don't know why that is. I mean, I know Frank Delmonico spent a lot of time in China and has traveled there, as I'm sure his delegates and team have. But I'm a little surprised by the. I would have thought, I was expecting, and in fact relying on the Transplantation Society as our representative international society to take a higher moral ground than perhaps even I would myself. So I feel a little bit left out on a wing in that one.
Following on from Mr. Vecchi's question, turning a blind eye to the sort of practices that it is asserted have happened is turning a blind eye to mass murder. How could it be that medical professions in a country such as your professionals, in a country like yours, could ever do such a thing?
I don't know. I think they must somehow be able to disconnect their day-to-day practice of surgery and transplantation from their ethics, and I don't know quite how that happens. I think we have to be very careful as professionals and as physicians not to cross that line. And when others do so, I think maybe it's through ignorance, through belief that such a practice couldn't be possibly occurring in China. I think that's probably it more. The belief that mass murder wouldn't be occurring, and that this is somehow being trumped up by groups that are being franchised somehow, and that's all I can take from that. It's difficult to understand clearly, but I think it must be based on a disbelief that this is occurring.
Professor Shapiro, thank you very much for making yourself available to the tribunal. I believe the time availability was limited. Your evidence is now concluded.
Thank you very much indeed.
I think you'd like us to have a break, wouldn't you?
Yes, sir. If you would like to break, I think it has been a long session.
And shall we be as firm as we are with the clock usually? Is it a half-an-hour break?
Half-an-hour break.
So precisely at 20 to 4.